Welcome, I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a look at all the work that the words do when you don't have the benefit of being able to see the person you're communicating with or hearing their words. Kathleen, we are thinking about a scenario where auditors write a report. Unusual, isn't it? And what happens with that communication in terms of conveying the message? Because we don't have the benefit of being able to see the person necessarily or being
Mhm.
able to hear the words and the inflection in their voice. So only the words are there. So you having that much experience in internal audit and communication, can you help us out as relates to this topic?
I would be happy to. First off, you're absolutely right. We are faced with such an important deliverable, and written communication is challenging enough as it is. But in the audit context, I think it's even more so. So here's a few things to guide us. First, focus on your reader or readers, because the reader and readers of an audit report may be quite a few. Do you have more than one group? Who is your primary audience? So, who is this message directed to, and who might also consume it? So, we have to think about primary and secondary users of this particular piece of communication. And then the second half of this graphic really gets into what do they specifically need to know. We don't want to clutter up this communication with details that might be important to us, but are not necessarily important to them. So, what do we want to put into it that's going to be meaningful? And what we're trying to do is to give them what they need, because very often this is a deliverable that they're going to respond to. So, who's going to respond? How is the report going to be used? Are there primary and secondary purposes for it? And how can I as a writer, make it as easy as possible for my readers to get what they need? Encourage people to really embody this as an individual writer, so that you are as on point as you can be.
And it's interesting because I've always, or for a very long time anyway, held this view that you write for the reader. You don't write for the writer,
Hmm.
especially as relates to what we do in internal audits. So, yes, you did all this work, but you're not writing for your own benefit. You are communicating the results and anything you want to convey, but you're writing for the readers themselves who may have different skill levels,
Hmm.
familiarity with the context or the topic, knowledge of the intricacies of the issues you're highlighting for them. So, we need to be very mindful about what knowledge they have and what interest they have in the communication that you're sharing with them. So that becomes very important as far as the communication. So when we're thinking about what goes into the message itself, how does that get analyzed, dissected? Let's say dissected. How do we
Sure.
evaluate the components of the message itself and how this fits into what we're addressing today?
Well, we can look at these proportions of all types of communication. And so, if we were talking about face to face communication, whether in person or at a distance, we know from research by Albert Morabian at UCLA that visual cues, what we see in terms of facial expression, body language, and so forth, account for 55%. Vocal cues, qualities of the voice, characteristics of the voice, tone, pace, things like that account for 38. And in face to face communication, the words only account for 7%. But we're talking here about something that where the words have to do all the work. So
Mhm. Yes.
this point is something that is occasionally lost on newer auditors, that we need to have a way to embed some of these cues that would come through the voice and the visual cues if we were face to face with the choice of the words that we use in our reports. And your point
Right.
about consumption, that we have people who are very attuned to what's going on or it has been happening for the arc of the audit project, and we have other people in the audience who are not. So it's not easy at all to strike this balance. This is a big challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the element of tone, which we highlight quite often in the profession, we talk about how we need to be very careful about the tone matching the message and not creating a distraction to the message itself, where the tone may be caustic and
Hmm.
creating a problem and making it even bigger, or diminishing or distorting the message in any way. Here, we're basically highlighting the fact that all you have is the words. And in, let's call it more informal communications, whether it is going to be email or something like that, but definitely we see it a lot in our world with texting, where people use emojis and they use different things like those, exclamation marks, and so on to highlight and to provide a little bit of tone and levity to communications. You don't have that. A report is a very formal document. So you have to be very mindful of your word choice and how that's going to be perceived in your communication. As we're looking at the elements that go into the communication itself and the attributes of effective communications, we have some guidance from the standards,
Hmm.
correct?
Yes.
What does it say about the elements of effective communication?
Well, these words come from standard IIA standard 2420, and
Mhm.
there are 7 words that we're going to talk about. And I'd like to reiterate what you were saying about the importance of tone. So, paying attention to these words will help a great deal in tone, and taking the focus off of ourselves will also help with being a good writer and giving people the information that they need. So the first 4 in Standard 2420 are accuracy, objectivity, clarity, and brevity. Or to use the terms that they use, accurate. How can we make our words completely accurate, free from errors, free from distortions, faithful to the underlying facts? This is something that needs to be factual.
Mhm.
Objectivity, fair, impartial, and biased. So we know that we have applied a fair, impartial, and unbiased process. Let's make sure that our words communicate that. That there's a balanced assessment here of all the relevant facts, of all the relevant circumstances, and our words are objective.
Mhm.
Clear and easily understood is what we're looking for here in the third item. It's logical. We avoid unnecessary technical language, providing all significant and relevant information. Now, this one is a little bit tricky because sometimes we might be, let's say some of us are IT auditors or aspire to be IT auditors among our viewer group. I can appreciate that in this context, you might be writing to people who have more of the technical background and would be very comfortable with certain terminology and acronyms, but that's not universally true for the entire audience. So it's important that we are mindful of that and that we don't leave anybody out.
And along those lines as well, I'm thinking about certain words that we sometimes use, and we really need to be very careful, of course. So when we say, for example, could or should or would or must, right? The choice of those words, it convey intent and
Hmm.
intensity. And in some cases, by using one word versus another, you may be confusing how absolute something is
Yes.
and so on. And of course, we have issues around typos in general, effect and affect, and all of that for clarity and so on. But just looking at those examples in terms of what exactly we're trying to convey, is this an absolute or is this a relative expression we're
Hmm.
conveying, and so on? So that's definitely part of this. Importance that we're trying to convey. So, when it comes to accuracy, what are some of the things as far as that and conciseness? I believe is another important piece, right?
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about the balance of the clarity and the conciseness, it's important that we get to the point. You mentioned that the focus should be on the reader, and so I like to encourage auditors again. This is not about us. This is not about what we did and how we did it. This is about what needs to change and why. So we need to give information to decision makers so that they can make a sound decision, not wax rhapsodical about the intricacies of the audit. And another thing about this, Hernan, that makes it challenging is that most of us have grown up in learning how to write in a very academic way, And academic writing is much more complex and is much more likely to have specific terminology and longer words and longer sentences. So I recognize that we're asking people to break some habits that they may have been holding on to for a long time. So when it
Sure.
comes to being brief, can we get to the point? Um, Not put a lot of unnecessary detail in there. Let's not be too wordy. Let's certainly not be repetitive or redundant, as this fourth item says.
Right. And just another thing that we often talk about is passive voice versus active voice.
Hmm.
And passive voice, although it softens the tone a bit, it may also make you sound less confident,
Hmm.
and it also takes more words. So I guess we're trying to be clear and we try to balance tone and we try to be concise. We need to balance all of those elements. And that's just another example of
Yes.
where the words have to do all the work for us, conveying the message.
Yes, absolutely.
What are some of the other attributes that we need to keep in mind?
So the last three in Standard 2420 are constructive, complete, and timely. Constructive is anything that's going to be helpful to the organization, leading to improvement where needed. And if I might hearken back to some other um, um, words that we used when talking about evidence, we talked about evidence being relevant and useful. So constructive is right in line with that usefulness that we talked about when it comes to audit evidence. That's going to be helpful to the organization. So think also the word useful. Um, and the balance between brevity and completeness comes up here. To be complete means to lack nothing essential to our target audience. The standard is written this way. I would love to put audiences, parentheses with the S
Mhm.
after audience, because there are going to be different kinds of folks who are going to consume this. So we need to
Sure.
make sure that we have everything that's significant and relevant to support the conclusions or recommendations, and not leave any of that out, but also not tilt toward being too wordy, too repetitive, and so forth. And
Yeah.
lastly, we know that the audit report writing process can be a little bit challenging in terms of bringing it all together. But I'd like people to remember that this standard 2420 also talks about timeliness. Let's make sure that we are opportune and expedient. There are two lovely words that you can add to your Scrabble game. Um, Depending on the significance of the issue, it's all about giving management the necessary opportunity to take appropriate action. And sooner is always better than later in this context. So let's make sure that our reports are timely, that our communication is timely.
So, on that note, when we think about what we're trying to communicate and how sensitive it is from a time perspective, you review transactions that in some cases are going to be historical, and you go through the whole process of the review, which adds time to that as well. And then if you take too long to issue your report, then there's such a lag between when the
Hmm.
transaction took place and what now when you're communicating the results or the impact of that transaction. And then lastly, what I believe also is that there's an element of almost like a depreciation that happens with the communication where the longer it takes, the value or the impact seems to diminish. So we
Yes.
want to do all of these things and do it quickly so that we can communicate to those who need to know and hopefully take corrective action. So this is very helpful because as we spend so much time writing internally, but also externally, in the form of these reports and try to get the communication out to those who are definitely anxious and waiting to hear from us and the results of the review. We want to make sure that we keep these things in mind. So thank you very much, Kathleen. I appreciate your help today.
It's my pleasure, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit related content.